Everything you think you know about Africa being called the Dark Continent is probably wrong. And the real reason behind this name is way more messed up than you'd expect. So you've heard Africa called the Dark Continent your whole life, right? Maybe in a history class, maybe in an old book, maybe even in a documentary. And most people just assume it means Africa was somehow backward or primitive or stuck in the past. But here's the thing, that's not even close to the full story. The truth behind this label involves exploration, propaganda, and one of the biggest misunderstandings in modern history. And today, we're going to break down exactly how this myth started, why it spread like wildfire, and what it tells us about how history gets twisted. Let's start with the obvious question. Why would anyone call an entire continent dark in the first place? I mean, Africa is literally where human civilization began. This is where some of the oldest kingdoms existed. We're talking about Egypt with its pyramids and advanced mathematics. We're talking about the kingdom of Kush that conquered Egypt at one point. We're talking about the Mali Empire that was so rich, its ruler Mansa Musa caused economic chaos in the Middle East just by passing through on a pilgrimage and giving away too much gold. But somehow, by the 1800s, Europe was calling Africa the Dark Continent, and that name stuck. It got printed in books, repeated in schools, and became the way most of the Western world thought about Africa for generations. Now here's where most people get it wrong. They hear Dark Continent and immediately think it's about the people who lived there. They assume it was a racist way of saying Africa was less developed or less civilized. And look, there was definitely racism involved in how Europeans talked about Africa during this time period. No question about that. But the actual origin of the phrase Dark Continent wasn't originally about the people at all. The term Dark Continent was first popularized by a Welsh explorer named Henry Morton Stanley. He used it as the title of a book he published in 1878 called Through the Dark Continent. And when Stanley said dark, he meant it literally. He was talking about how Europeans didn't know what was in the interior of Africa. To them, it was unmapped territory. It was a mystery. It was dark in the sense that they were in the dark about what was actually there. Think about it like this. If someone tells you they're in the dark about a situation, they mean they don't have information. That's what Stanley was getting at. European maps of Africa in the 1800s had coastlines drawn out pretty well because European ships had been trading along the coasts for centuries. But the middle of the continent? That part of the map was basically blank. They'd write unexplored territory or just draw some speculative mountains and rivers. They genuinely didn't know what was there. But here's where things get complicated and honestly pretty dark in a different way. Because even though the phrase started as "we don't know what's there," it very quickly morphed into something much worse. European powers were about to carve up Africa in what historians call the Scramble for Africa, and they needed to justify it. They needed a reason to tell their own citizens back home why they were sending armies and colonizers to take over other people's land. So the narrative shifted. Africa went from being dark because it was unknown to being dark because it supposedly needed to be enlightened by European civilization. You see how that works? It's a clever piece of propaganda. They took a phrase that originally meant unexplored and twisted it to mean uncivilized and savage and in need of saving. And this is where we need to talk about what was actually happening in Africa during this time. Because the myth requires you to believe that Africa was somehow sitting still, not developing, just waiting for Europeans to show up. But that's completely false. Let me give you some examples. In West Africa, cities like Timbuktu were major centers of learning. The Sankore University in Timbuktu had one of the largest libraries in the world during the medieval period. Scholars came from all over to study there. We're talking about advanced studies in astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and law. This was happening while Europe was going through its own dark ages, by the way. In East Africa, the Swahili city-states were running sophisticated trade networks across the Indian Ocean. They were trading with India, with Arabia, with Persia, with China. These weren't just simple village economies. These were complex urban societies with their own architectural styles, their own writing systems, their own legal codes. In southern Africa, you had Great Zimbabwe, which was the capital of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe. The stone ruins there are so impressive that when European colonizers first saw them in the late 1800s, they refused to believe Africans could have built them. They made up theories about how it must have been built by Phoenicians or Arabs or anyone except the actual Bantu people who lived there. That's how strong the Dark Continent myth had become. It made people deny reality right in front of their eyes. But the thing is, Europeans didn't want to hear about any of this. It didn't fit the narrative. If you're trying to justify colonizing a place and taking its resources, it's a lot easier if you convince everyone back home that you're doing them a favor. That you're bringing civilization to the uncivilized. that you're shining light into the darkness. And this brings us to one of the most frustrating parts of this whole myth. The reason European maps didn't show the interior of Africa wasn't because nothing was there. It was because Europeans simply hadn't mapped it yet for themselves. But Africans knew their own geography. They had their own maps, their own trade routes, their own ways of navigating the continent. The Sahara Desert, which Europeans thought of as this impossible barrier, had been crossed by African traders for thousands of years. They knew where the water sources were, they knew the safe routes, they had entire trade networks set up. But European explorers would show up and act like they were discovering these places for the first time, even when they were being guided by local people who had lived there for generations. It's like if I walked into your house with a map, saw rooms I hadn't personally drawn on my map yet, and then claimed I discovered those rooms. It's absurd when you think about it. Henry Morton Stanley, the guy who popularized the term, is actually a perfect example of this. His famous expedition to find Dr. Livingstone in Africa. He didn't navigate through the wilderness alone. He had a massive caravan of African guides and porters who actually knew the terrain. But when he wrote his books and gave his lectures back in Europe, he presented himself as this brave explorer venturing into the unknown. He downplayed or completely ignored the contributions of the Africans who made his journey possible. And this pattern repeated over and over. European explorers would rely entirely on African knowledge to get anywhere, then turn around and describe Africa as a place without knowledge. They'd trade with sophisticated African kingdoms, then describe Africans as people who didn't understand trade. They'd see impressive architecture, then claim Africans couldn't have built it. The cognitive dissonance was unreal. Now let's talk about why this myth was so effective. It wasn't just about justifying colonization in the moment. It had long-term effects that lasted way beyond the colonial period. When you tell people that an entire continent is backward and uncivilized, that story doesn't just disappear when the colonies gain independence. It shapes how people think for generations. Even today, you'll see news coverage about Africa that focuses almost entirely on poverty, disease, and conflict. Not that those things don't exist. They absolutely do, and they're serious issues. But they exist everywhere. Yet somehow when it comes to Africa, that's often all you hear about. You don't hear as much about the thriving tech scene in Lagos or Nairobi. You don't hear about the growing economies. You don't hear about the innovations happening in mobile banking or renewable energy. The Dark Continent myth created a lens through which people view Africa, and that lens is really hard to change. Here's the most important thing to understand about this whole situation. The Dark Continent myth wasn't just an innocent misunderstanding that happened because of lack of information. It was a deliberate narrative that served a specific purpose. European powers needed to justify the Berlin Conference of 1884, where they literally sat around a table and drew lines on a map, dividing up African territories among themselves without a single African representative in the room. Think about how wild that is. Imagine if a group of people got together and decided to divide up your neighborhood, your city, your country, and you weren't even invited to the meeting. That's what happened to an entire continent. And the Dark Continent myth made it easier for them to do this because they'd already convinced themselves and their citizens that Africans couldn't govern themselves anyway. The legacy of those arbitrary colonial borders is still causing problems today. Countries were created without any regard for existing ethnic groups, traditional territories, or natural boundaries. Groups that had been enemies were forced together. Groups that had been allies were split apart. And then when these countries gained independence in the mid-1900s, they inherited these nonsense borders that had been drawn by people who didn't know or care about the local reality. So let's wrap this up and make sense of everything we've talked about. The Dark Continent myth started as a phrase meaning unexplored or unknown, specifically from a European perspective. Henry Morton Stanley popularized it in his 1878 book. But almost immediately the meaning shifted from, "we don't know what's there," to, "there's nothing worth knowing there," to, "they need us to civilize them." This wasn't an accident. It was propaganda that served the purposes of colonization. It made it easier for European powers to justify taking over African territories during the Scramble for Africa. And it worked so well that the myth persisted long after the colonial period ended. The reality is that Africa was never dark in any meaningful sense. It had ancient civilizations, centers of learning, sophisticated trade networks, impressive architecture, and complex political systems long before Europeans showed up. The fact that Europeans hadn't mapped these things yet didn't mean they didn't exist. It just meant Europeans were late to the party. And this matters today because the way we talk about history shapes how we think about the present. When you grow up hearing that an entire continent was backward and primitive, that affects how you view current events, how you think about foreign aid, how you react to African immigrants, how you evaluate African culture and achievements. The myth has consequences that ripple through time. The good news is that we can choose to learn the real history. We can recognize where these myths came from and why they were created. We can seek out African voices and African perspectives on African history instead of just accepting the European narrative. And we can be more critical when we see modern media falling into the same old traps of only showing one side of a very complex and diverse continent. Africa isn't a country, by the way. It's a continent with 54 different countries, thousands of ethnic groups, and over 1 billion people. The idea that you could sum all of that up with a single label like dark continent is ridiculous on its face. But that's what happens when you let propaganda replace actual knowledge. If this changed how you think about history, hit subscribe because we're breaking down more myths like this.